South America, doing loans and partnerships. They have been doing this long before there were things like ESG and things like that. They're still on incredible momentum with mix of, their farming knowledge, their indigenous knowledge, things like that they're doing. I would say also in Australia, we're still seeing good momentum around the projects we want to do. So for instance, I'll reference loans again. There's a lot of appetite and product market fit for the type of loans that we want to do in nature-linked areas, and the farmers, and there's obviously lots of different farmers out there, but we're seeing lots of the farmers we know here in Tasmania and Western Australia and other places really looking towards how can they break down some of the systems that are there to actually get recognised for the stewardship they do of their lands and integrate those models better, whether we're talking about protecting natural values, we're talking about having some renewable energy, continuing with more regenerative or organic or whatever type of agriculture that they would like to do. It's all those pieces coming together. So we haven't really seen in a lot of our work the appetite diminish, but also I would say public sentiment. So politically, it is changing a lot of, I think, public sentiment and the people that we talk to have a huge appetite for nature. And I think that's only growing. The Biodiversity Council did a survey just before the federal election here in Australia, and there was a huge amount of response to how much people do care about nature. It's just really how does that apply to policy pathways and the work that we can all do. And I think that systems change to put nature back into the economy and all these systems is really hard. But I'll hand over to Paul and let him see how he's going.
Thanks, Liz. I mean, I think, it's easy to feel like whatever is happening right now is what will happen forever. But if you step back, it's political cycles, and governments come and go, presidents come and go, policies come and go. Nature doesn't come and go, right? This is a topic. It's a conversation. It's a fundamental kind of we don't exist if we don't have nature. And I think at a foundational level, every human being kind of understands that, depending on where you're at in your kind of awareness kind of journey, Barry. And I think, the last conversation we had, Danny asked the question, how important is it that you've done the inner work to kind of get it and understand it? And I think, at the moment, there's a number of world leaders who just probably are in desperate need of a bit of inner work. But they will come and go. This is, and how important is what you personally care about versus public opinion. In my mind, public opinion is irrelevant. And I think, I think this would apply to everyone on the call and their own experience. If there's something that you feel strongly and deeply enough about, there's a fair chance there's a lot of other people who feel the same. They just haven't had someone step forward and show the leadership or the courage to express it against the tide. And I think often when you do that, you find your tribe and you find a collective of other people who feel the same, and then you can make a difference.
I love that thought, and that kind of stability and groundedness of being in service to the long arc of time, or being in service to big nature, as you said. It's funny that you were talking about big nature versus little nature, which gets us to the heart, I think, of this conversation between the two of you. Because Lisa, you're working, like, the Quoin is a 5,000 hectare site in Tasmania, which I heard beautifully referred to as a living laboratory of solutions for nature. And Paul, you're wanting to bring nature back into cities. Lise, can you repeat everything you said earlier before we turn the cameras on, where you were talking about we're going right up into not only the systems level thinking about cities, urban to rural kind of relationship, but really the like I recently had a conversation with Indy Johar we were talking about, where he talked about the talisman of the house, what the house represents in the human imagination. And then there's what the city represents and the nation state. And if we're talking about big nature, we're all living in big nature, but we make things smaller with our design minds. So where can we go between the 5,000 hectares of the Quoin and the work that Paul is doing every day? How do we build the sort of network of aliveness instead of this patchwork of, you know, people doing meaningful work and everyone else sort of enhancing business as usual?
Yeah, and you're exactly right. So far, Wedgetail, we haven't had, and not to say we have no urban projects, but we haven't had many yet. And we have started learning, and we often talk about systems learning in these bigger landscapes. And that's been in Tassie, but it's also been, as I said, in Central and South America and understanding Indonesia. But you quickly realize, which we all know, it's all interconnected, and how these, when we talk about ecosystem services, they're all connected into these areas of incredible forest, for instance, in the central Victorian Highlands, and what water they supply to the city of Melbourne, and what filtration and flooding, you know, all these pieces that they do. And so I guess, as we were discussing before, it was this idea that cities have become these places of huge ecological disruption just because there's so many humans together, which for the future isn't necessarily a bad thing. And maybe we can discuss that later, about humans being concentrated in these spaces and, you know, not just expanding across the whole of the landscape. But how do we turn them into ecological nodes, I think, is the really interesting piece. And what does that mean? And I think you've had some great conversations in the past chats around things like biophilic design, biomimicry, bringing standards into buildings. And then I think you start to think about the city and the region that it lives in, and how does it interconnect as a system. And I've been looking at this term like urban metabolism, which I'm not sure if a lot of other people know, but you kind of have ecosystem services, which is what nature does. And then you think about, we've built this city, so a lot of, even if we integrate nature back into it, it's still going to be quite curated by humans. So how does that idea of the urban metabolism, like how does a city breathe? How does it eat, digest, give back, start to work? And how do you get that closer and closer to the ecosystem services, if that makes sense?
I love it, because you're also bringing up for me when you say that, and I don't know if it's the true of anyone on the call who works in sort of human inner development and psychology. Like if you turned, I love thinking of urban metabolism because that makes it a living thing.
Yep.
That breathes and has sort of organs. And, you know, we were talking about the work of Regen Melbourne in identifying that we need to talk about the Yarra River as an alive thread through a living organism, and that if you actually engage with it from, you know, end to end, it's a life source, but it's also, you know, it's a place that we gather, it's a place that we can be in our bodies and be with community. So it's an antidote to loneliness, and it's formations for community. And how do we do that? By thinking of urban metabolism as both beneficial for human and ecological repair.
Yeah, I think exactly. And how do you build, I guess, because I was always thinking initially, how do you build ecosystem services in a city? But I feel like this urban metabolism idea, which is not my idea, it's something that I've been reading about, can pull it back to where can we get the stepping stones? And this is where we start to see the projects like the Swimmable Yarra, or, you know, Seattle has an incredible pollinator corridor through their streets. Or even I think Melbourne again has that that wetland area in the sort of main Royal Park there that is doing some sort of green infrastructure. So how do we start to get those pieces in that start this idea of what are the flows? So what are the flows of materials and water and species and food into cities? And then what are the feedback loops that we're starting to think about as they interact? So that when you get into that more circular economy, like what's the waste? How does it come back into the city, or how does it support nature? And then what are the key functions? And that's when you start to go, well, the Yarra is really important. Is it a key function? Let's address that as a project.
Yeah, love it. Paul, are you thinking that way in the work that you're doing, the sort of link between your experiences in big nature, which is absolutely not dense urban environments, and your work in dense urban environments?
I mean, we are within the current system. Uh, I mean, the big picture question is if you removed the illusion of separateness that we all abide by as the human condition, how would you design cities differently? If you accept that we are part of and integrated with living systems rather than above them, how would you design cities differently? And I think it's really only, I don't know the exact numbers, but it's really the industrial age that just was a really black chapter in our species' history. I mean, for most of history, we lived in harmony with nature, right? But these modern cities, they basically perpetuate the illusion of separateness, and we tried to make ourselves separate from nature in our cities to protect ourselves, make ourselves safe, get rid of all the messiness and frustration that comes with living with other species and with nature. But in the meantime, we've completely fucked ourselves up, mental health and other issues. So it needs a complete change in mindset now as to how we think about cities from an industrial kind of capitalist, machine-led mindset to reintegrating healing country, thinking about how we can turn cities into a positive that, become part of a much broader living set of systems as opposed to little citadels that we hide in.
It's making me think, Paul, we met or we knew about each other from the Jane Goodall event, that remarkable.
Well, you were on stage with Jane. I was in the audience, but yeah, we didn't,
I don't want to brag, but I was. And just so incredible what she said, so wise, like at the time there were 3 famous women scientists, primatologists, who were working on different ape species, trying to save them as the patchwork of a live landscape shrank ever further around them and started to like strangle the entire sort of ecology of the species. And we've done that in so many different ways. But what Jane said that was so wise that I keep thinking about is she said in a lot of those activist environments and even those other primatologists, their lens was human beings are evil and bad and need to be fenced out and locked out and beaten back. So the separateness is kind of at a core level. And while you're both talking, I'm imagining, and maybe there's some amazing artists in this call who can do this kind of mapping, but wouldn't it be beautiful to have that sort of map without separateness, which is really an Indigenous lens from what I understand, from what I've heard. Like Melbourne sits on big nature, so instead of seeing it as a rabbit warren of streets, we map the big nature and these sort of systems of aliveness, and then overlaid that map is the human ecology. Because not weaving us, as Jane Goodall was always saying, if you don't weave the human story, the suffering, the messiness, the need for belonging, and even the shadow, the need to dominate, because we're talking about domination to integration here. If we're going to do serious integration, we have to factor in the human inner life and that story we started off talking about. Policy emerges from the story of us, what we prioritize, what we think is most important. And you both work at this amazing kind of stretch from the sort of scale to intimacy. It's the scale of big nature and the fact that, at a core big story, can we stop with the story of separateness? But the story of separateness was also a human sort of way of protecting ourselves. So what is this integration process that we can do where we really do account for our own humanity and how flawed it is and how messy it is. Because I think one of the flaws in maybe the way we've seen our way from where we are, the triage of all the problems we're in, to the vision of where we're going, is there's a kind of utopia that we're going towards. And that's problematic in and of itself. How do you both calibrate sort of best practice between the depth of your sort of spiritual inclination, Paul, if I can call it that, and love, to projects on the ground, and how you prioritize and sense make for what's worth doing?
I'll let you go
Yeah,
first.
I mean, yeah, I mean, you've got to operate within the current system, right? And so what we're doing is trying to demonstrate using independent, credible research that there is an investment return on going rogue on nature, from a rates per square meter on what you can sell an apartment for, in terms of sales velocity, in terms of future proofing. So it's manipulating the system to achieve the outcome.
Incentives, really focusing in on incentives
Correct.
and disincentives.
That's right. And and I've talked about it before, but not one of Australia's ESD rating tools has a mandatory requirement for any living landscape. So you can have a 6-star Green Star rated building that's concrete and glass. So the system is, and developers are box tickers. We're just, everyone's trying to do the right thing, but they're looking to the authorities to tell us what ESD excellence means. And at the moment, the authorities are saying ESD excellence is all about reducing carbon emissions using tech. And tech dates real quick. Nature doesn't date. And so, that the boxes need to change, but then at another level, there needs to be much higher level thinking about, instead of all these buildings becoming more nature focused, how do we piece that together, to Lisa's idea, into corridors? And that the developers can't do that. That has to happen at a government level, and to make a decision that we're gonna do it at a systems level. Sorry, Lisa.
No, that was great. And just building on that, just going back to what you said there, Barry, I do think the environmental movement, and I put myself in this in terms of when I studied conservation biology and all that, needs to put more humanity into it, because we are to accept ourselves as part of nature, which we are, and to talk about ourselves more. And when we try and express our impact, we talk about nature, business, and people. And so we really try and think about that people component. But going back to what Paul was saying about the incentives, I also think, and this isn't true of all the models, but as we dig into these models and include nature, we're actually starting to see it does make economic sense. So we're actually starting to see that green infrastructure is often more affordable and easier to either curate or support, like conserve and things like that, than it is to build grey. We're actually seeing right now, as you said, Paul, those sort of drawdown technologies for carbon are not, as they've been developed and innovated on them, and I'm very hopeful that will continue. Nature, bang for buck, does a much better job. And so if you're going to think about protection of forests or things like that right now, that will be much more economically viable than some of these technologies that haven't come down the track yet. And so I think as you start to pull nature into these spaces, you start to see that it does make economic sense. And I would say that insurance companies are some of the first to start realizing this, and they're starting to shift their investments more into green infrastructure over grey and stuff like that. So I'd say that it is happening, but we need more models and more digging and more data around how you bring, nature into some of these systems.
And Barry, I saw Andy, and Andy, thanks for your comment just then on where the UK is. UK have got a mandatory biodiversity net gain tool that you have to satisfy. That's where the Green Building Council are heading with their nature roadmap at the moment. Green Building Council moving at a glacial pace towards that. The problem with the biodiversity net gain framework that we are moving towards, and that already exists in London, is you can satisfy it by buying credits, which is great if you're doing, forestry projects or something in Tasmania. It doesn't help the cities. The city can still be grey, and we've got generations of kids. We've got 2/3 of the world population living in cities, generations of kids growing up in cities with no direct connection to nature. So the system has to be completely turned on its head. Very.
There's a lot of great questions in the chat, and I'll turn to them in a minute. I think it's a slight pivot, Dan. I don't know if you wanted to heckle me in particular. You were keen to heckle me earlier. But I think we're going to go to talking about AI and whether there's sort of one of the human stories at the moment is this sort of techno-optimist lens that will be able to solve for all our problems with widgets and robots. Definitely humanity is not that included in that story. Sort of get out of the way. We're a subpar species that hasn't done well with decision making. But Lisa, I know you have a different sort of perspective on a tech future and nature. What is a lens? What is one way we can look at this moment we're in? I mean, every conversation I have with people of a certain political leaning, they're like, the AI gold rush is on and all the energy is in that space. And like, I would love that to be me. Because, if you're not worried about biodiversity and species loss and all the things that sort of occupy my mind, that's a utopian future to head towards that doesn't have any of those organic requirements. But I know you see it differently, so I'd love you to share some of your thoughts.
Yeah, I think that, like I said, I'd worked in technology for a long time, and I am an optimist about like new technologies and how can they be used to innovate. I would encourage everyone in this call and listening to this call that we need people who have this lens towards nature or climate or food systems to be really getting inside these tools too. Because if we just leave it to some of the technologists that have, they're going to engineer our way out of this or create the robots, that's not all of it. We need to have all these other inclusive views. But I would bring it back to, we have started using machine learning or AI in lots of the work that we do at the Quoin, because one of the things we're trying to do is really reduce the costs that it takes to measure biodiversity effectively with high integrity, because there are all these people, participants around the world, whether they be a farmer, a producer, an indigenous group, that as these sort of standards, whether you talk about the EU deforestation standards or things come down, they've got to show that they're doing great work in conservation, restoration, sustainable use, adaptation. And so you need to be able to prove that. And we've typically done that through ecologists on the ground and other things like that. But as we, for instance, use things like more sophisticated mapping and remote sensing using LiDAR models, we use what's called camera traps, which are motion activated cameras in the landscape to pick up species and species behavior. And like humans just can't get these things, because if you're a human out there, you're usually at certain times and you're leaving scent and making noise and, all these sort of things. We're using acoustic monitoring if you think about what you could monitor acoustically, it's birds and insects and frogs, but also even mammals and how they move through the landscape. And you can pick up all these things, but because you end up with these huge amounts of data, that needs to obviously put into machine learning systems to really get the 20,000 images of moving grass out, and you find there's a spotted tail quoll and an eastern quoll and a wombat and a devil. I'm obviously talking about our property, and you really get that incredible stuff. But I guess what I'm trying to highlight there is we've found it's accelerated the work of ecologists. So ecologists spend time doing different things, or they move to the data more quickly. So we're not using ecologists. We are just integrating them with the technology. And I think this talks to what technology can do. So as an evolutionary biologist, we have limits on our intelligence, on how we view a landscape. We're only so high. We've only got eyes that work so well.
Not us, Lisa, not you and I, but just generally. Yeah.
Yeah. And so if we can layer technology on to help us be better and do better, and then obviously as we get into the intelligence space, it's really interesting of who is designing that and how is it helping. But imagine, and I know it's always the one that I think of because I'm just an animal lover, like imagine if we could figure out how we could better understand other intelligence on this planet. whether it be animals and plants and all the networks and tools and communication that they already have to make the planet as it is as this healthy functioning system. So I guess there's always concern and there's always all these scenarios, and I love thinking through scenarios and reading what all the predictions are. But I also think that all of us have to be very active in this space and pushing towards including, just like the economy, including nature in it, to really make sure that we're having those developments in AI in those areas as well.
I'm not,
yeah,
I'm look, I'm not a technologist at all, and I don't understand AI, but I do feel all of our problems because we spend too much time and make too many decisions with this, and AI is just perpetuating that way of thinking, and we need to make more decisions and kind of feel more into other ways of knowing, which AI cannot replicate.
Yeah, but
And
maybe that's what Lise is kind of, because I've heard this, of course, from tech savvy folk who've like created some of the systems that are driving innovation. It is an innovation landscape that could very well take enormous amounts of admin load and bureaucratic load off of us so that our other intelligences can be of use more readily. We have, that's the sort of optimistic version of this story, is not that we become fat, lazy, like those weird creatures on the hoverboards in that movie with the little robot, that we've like lost. Wall-E, that we become these weird floating blobs that have no purpose and have no use and are deleterious to every environment we're in. But maybe it gives us more time to tap into our deep humanity. And I loved the thought, Lisa, that what we feed the machine processes. So if we're asking it to do all the dastardly things in the shadow of humanity, it will process the information on that. And if we're asking it, can we have a conversation with that humpback whale that just went around the tip of Australia? Maybe we could do that. Like, that would be crazy. And all of the problems that it could solve being a mega processor and super intelligence. Yeah. It's a super scary space, but one I'm happy to touch, because I know I've started a series on the podcast in AI and I'm terrified to have those conversations. But what's opening up is what we feed it really matters.
And obviously the examples I gave there in landscapes are very, in some ways, simple if you think about what people are doing scenarios, but I think it's just showing that it can accelerate us. It can make us better. I'm sure a lot of people on this call maybe use ChatGPT and other things to make their work a little bit better, maybe better emails or quicker or whatever the pieces that you might be doing. And so I do agree, Paul, though, with this knowing, and there's a lot of, like, humans do a lot of thinking and get caught in their heads, but I don't think AI has to be exactly the same. Like, we're obviously talking about the language models and how we interact with them there, but I think that there's lots of opportunity. It should thread and integrate a lot of knowledge systems, and that should be Indigenous, scientific, entrepreneurial, technology. Like, it should be able to be integrating these things, but also what are the humans best at? And humans actually should be getting better at what we're best at. So, and I just really think about how we integrate that. And I think we should all participate in it, I guess, is my main message. Not that everyone should be like, AI is going to be great and that type of thing, but I think it's going to keep coming. And as you said, Berry, the investment, everyone, every investor, everyone, every deck that I see has a slide on AI. Everyone is talking about it. Doesn't matter. It's a nature tech deck and they've got the mandatory slide. I think that it's happening, so we need to get involved and we need to bring our perspectives.
Yeah, and Australia didn't have it mentioned anywhere in the budget, just flagging. Like, well, the world moves at a cracking pace on so many things. AI is like the biggest new landscape, and Australia mentions it nowhere. Meanwhile, we have 19 collapsing ecosystems. So these are realities, and I love the idea of engagement, what that looks like. And Small Giants Academy team, maybe we need to do something on that. What what AI futures would look like if the right incentives are baked in to the neural network.
Well, imagine, sorry, Barry, I'll just say one last thing on it. This idea of how we, and it's a very human way of thinking, but look across landscapes strategically. So we just talked about cities as nodes, and then landscapes and agriculture and all these sort of systems that sit around them. But we've done a very poor job of thinking about them holistically. And where are the areas, like you said, 19 collapsing ecosystems? What ecosystems in Australia really need to be protected, and renewable projects should not go there? And therefore, where should renewable projects be? And where is the highest and best use farming land and all these other things? Imagine if AI could figure this out at a much more integrated and detailed level than we've done a terrible job at it, and we keep siloed in terms of how we think about it. So for instance, in Tassie, recently they said they were going to log an area at the head of a river, and a huge amount of farming land is irrigated off that river if you don't care about the biodiversity and other things. So there's never this integrated holistic lens. And I would be hopeful that AI and other things would help us get better at this holistic thinking about what's going on here.
I think that we're going to hit and come up against like core human stories like property ownership and what are human rights as they clash with the rights of big nature. What, like, to get from domination to integration, which was the theme of this conversation, we are going to hit up against core human stories for definitely sort of Western civilizational maps of how we build, what are our priorities, how we make decisions. So there's a lot of amazing stuff happening in the chat, and we have like no minutes. We have 15 minutes. Jeremy, I just was like delighted the deliciousness of your question of whether Mush and Zuck have done the inner work. That is a glorious question for all of us to ponder. I think we might have some answers there. Yeah, the inner to outer life reflection mode is in full activation. Arguably not. But if anyone knows Musk or Zuck, tell them we have some excellent programs that integrate the inner and the outer. You're welcome. So where should we go? That's super duper real. I'm going to go up to the top here. Oh, well, this is great. Jeremy, I'll stay with you. Do you want to ask your question about cities being truly sustainable? What is that question?
Yeah, that'd be great. Thanks, Barry.
Yeah.
Yeah, I suppose I'm borrowing some notions from Tyson Yunkaporta about cities never being able to persist in the longer term, and that they will always crumble. And certainly that's been the case historically. But I just wonder if our guest speakers could maybe comment on that, and whether in the really sort of in deep time kind of picture that we actually need to start thinking bigger about dismantling them in ways that are feasible, or is that just simply impossible?
Great question, Jeremy. Paul, do you want to go first, and then I'll jump in?
Yeah, I mean, it is a good question. I mean, we don't like to think about it, but everything's impermanent, including every structure that we put up. Even every brand new building at some point is going to be obsolete and demolished. So there's a lot of, it's not necessarily directly about nature, but there's a lot of thinking going on in my industry about how you can create circular building materials that have minimal impact from a carbon emission perspective. I know Uni in Melbourne are doing a lot of work on that, but it's about accepting that impermanence and making sure the materials that we're using, are having a minimal impact when that occurs. If I think that's your question, Jeremy. Yep.
Yeah, I'd add that I think, yes, like there's been this over time, especially when we've not looked after the nature around some of those spaces. So there's obviously all sorts of geopolitics and other things happening, but you lose resources. You don't have the timber or whatever it is, you don't have the water, and that obviously leads to that crumbling. So I think that if we can sort of step back, and I guess I didn't say at the start, I've worked on big landscapes, but as they get closer and closer to cities, now I live in Launceston, which some people might not term a city here in Tassie, but I really see part of the reason for moving here is you can see the connection between the greater landscape and the city much more clearly than I could in a city like Sydney, because it's been so removed from that. And I think that there's a lot of lessons to be learned around how do we, there does need to be a disassembling of sorts. And you see like that huge canal in Singapore, I think it was this massive big concrete structure has been turned back into a winding river that has biodiversity. Like that's a deconstruction back into something that will serve the population better and have all these ecosystem services. The other thing I'd say is climate change might start to force this too, Jeremy. So we're going to see areas of cities, coastal areas, areas that are too low lying that can't, like they're just not going to be places that can be inhabitable. So how are we going to not necessarily build a whole lot of grey infrastructure fortress around that, but what is the green infrastructure that should be thought about, and then how should those cities be changed to sort of accommodate that? I think will be really interesting.
One example I'll give is, I mean, the 3-hour presentation I just came out of is a confidential bidding process for the Arden precinct down here in Melbourne, which is 12 hectares around the new metro station. So, I can't talk about the details, but that area of Melbourne was, for almost all of history, known as the Blue Lake, and it was a gathering place for First Nations people. When colonisation happened and the city of Melbourne was put here, we renamed it as Batman's Swamp, and then we started dumping stuff in it, and we filled it up, and we turned it into the city slums, and then we turned it into industrial rail yards, and so now it's being reinvented again, and part of that reinvention is about healing that part of Melbourne and creating a new open space. So it's just a constant kind of, destruction, reconstruction of what will continue in that long time of, arc of time that Barry referred to. It'll be something different in another 200 years. Mm-hmm. But it's how do we do that in a way that's reflecting a more enlightened way of our integration with living systems? That's important, I think.
Yeah, it's bringing up for me the human story. Like, you can't kind of capture the human story, and we've got tech algorithms driven by profit motives to fuck with the human story and sort of mess with our ability to cohere and collectively sense make and prioritize together, and suddenly get this blowout of polarization. And then what's interesting about healed or landscapes that humans are required to repair is there's an experiential sort of, I've loved everything you've said, Paul, around impermanence and interdependence. Like, one of the questions that Anthony asked was like, how do we get everybody to care? And I think it's the experience of repaired landscapes. It's the experience of hope in living ecosystems that enters the bones at in a beyond language way, that hopefully future generations. I mean, we've broken from nature stories before, Paul, so you're probably right. It's impermanent. We just, every generation have to keep weaving ourselves back into the miracle of life. Maybe that's what it is to be human. There is enough time for a few questions. Where do we go? Anthony, you've asked a couple of questions. I want to go there in a second, but was? I don't know how to say was, Peel.
Correct.
Was. So proud of myself, pronunciation excellence. I love your idea about a collab, like, noted. Small Giants team are on the call, noted. If anyone wants to be a part of that, click a thumbs up on Waz's comment about a Small Giants and Wedgetail collab, talking about tech and innovation. But we might do it online because schedules are hellish. But okay, we'll do that from here. Excellent. There's a lot of other things here which we wanted to talk about, but maybe we just won't get there, which is examples. Like, what are the best practice examples that inspire you both around the world? And maybe we can talk about that at the end. But Anthony, did you want to ask one of your amazing questions? How do we get people involved leveraging AI? Yeah, you had so many great questions.
I'm Barry. I mean, there was a couple. I mean, one was and Paul talked about it, that it's, it's about consciousness, like what people do and what they don't do comes from consciousness. So one question was, well, what do we do to change consciousness? And the other one was Lisa's saying we need to get involved in AI. So I was wondering what you were thinking there. Is that we need to use it and leverage it, or do we need to do something more fundamental about actually influencing the core applications and platforms and models?
That's a good question, Anthony. Good to meet you. I think definitely we need to use it and stay across what's being discussed in terms of, there is a conversation. So I think Scott Farquhar spoke at the National Press Club a week or 2 weeks ago. He was obviously talking about AI. Barry was referencing it hadn't been sort of really commented in the budget and other places. But then obviously internationally, a lot of the models we use are coming out of US. There's obviously models being built in China. And so I think we have to be actively participating, but also, like, I do go and read what are the scenario pieces, what do we think's happening? And so we always, as constituents and voters and all those sort of things, we should participate. But then, for instance, we're running a project, and this isn't maybe a great example, but ways that we're trying to get involved and bring, I guess, nature into these spaces and attract people in these sectors. So I've talked at some tech conferences, and obviously I have a background in tech, but bringing nature into those spaces, and those people who are working on it and developing it aren't always thinking about those spaces and how they could, solve problems in them. But also we are doing a call for people to work on Tasmanian bird acoustics, for instance, at the moment. And there's a lot of, in putting that sort of out there, that request for proposals, we're really, again, saying, hey, we think that there are technology solutions here. We need to have more of the calls. And this is the way that we see this progressing. And I guess they're just small examples of us trying to be in the mix, talking about these problems, talking to researchers and universities who are doing this stuff, and including nature as part of that conversation. I don't know, Barry or Paul, if you have other ideas. And I know it was my suggestion to everyone to get involved, but those were some of mine.
Well, you didn't.
Zero suggestions. I don't really understand AI.
I'm super conscious that, first of all, the chat is super alive and juicy, and I wish we could get to all of them. Lynn, I loved your question about, like, there are so many layers of questions, and we have 3 minutes in which to solve them. And I feel the pressure of time. And so I wonder, on like a finishing question for you both that might just help us all round up. You both lean into this space, as Danny said earlier in the chat, with hope and determination at a pretty gnarly moment. What should we all here take away as a kind of working model frame for how to proceed with really systems change on every level, from human psychology, story, property development, policy environments, business and finance, investment, like making the case for nature and interdependence?
I'll go first, and I would just say that, I guess, at Wedgetail, like I said earlier, we try and do systems learning that hopefully evolves into some systems thinking, but we really try and stay across all these different sort of areas. But then we act, you have to be acting as well. So it's not just the thinking and the strategies, but the actual doing. And we learn the most through doing. And we know that through our tech careers, you've got to be in action, doing it. And there's no point in making a plan. And so we balance between those two things all the time. And I think that bird, request for bird acoustic work is an example of a very little action in a bigger, broader system of what, is happening in AI. Or for instance, we've done a nature-linked loan with Feld's Farm, who are a group down near Hobart. And if we look at the Hobart lens, they're doing a market garden, they're doing nature positive work, they're doing organic farming, and they just distribute, like we looked at their supply supply chain and they distribute just into that city. And so we try and obviously advance them with the loan, get them to do the nature work which they're already wanting to do, but also think about how does that tiny little project then integrate with that broader city of Hobart. And I guess I'll just say that would be my main message, always be in action while you're trying to think about the broader system. But the systems thinking really helps you see the levers, and they aren't always the obvious things that you think that they will be.
I don't have an answer to what we should be doing. I think shoulds are, I don't like the word should. I know what I'm doing, and I know that matters to me. And I think in terms of wrapping it up, you know, I think we run into problems when we see life as a journey with a start and an end and a destination. I think it's much more empowering if you see life as a dance. And my kind of parting words would be, regardless of what music is playing, just stay on the dance floor.
You know what, everyone? You thought you were coming for a conversation about nature-based cities, but really, it was the wisdom hour. Oh,
Just stay on the dance floor,
stay
even
on
if
the
you don't like
dance
the
floor.
song.
You know what I love about that is that this work doesn't become desperate and heavy and hard and like it's about what we're lacking and we're always, it's a party. And do you want to come?
Yeah.
And let's all be on party planet together and make a future that we would all love to gift future generations. Thank you both. Thank you, everyone on the call. Let's do it. Stay in the doing, stay on the dance floor, rock and roll.
Thanks, Barry. Thanks, Lisa.
Thanks, Barry.